The summer of 1812 opened with one of the most ambitious military campaigns in recorded history. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, stood at the height of his power. He commanded not merely a French army, but a coalition of kingdoms, duchies, and subject nations and empires stretching from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the frontiers of Prussia and Austria. Yet, in that summer, Napoleon would march eastward into the vastness of Russia, seeking to bend the Tsar to his will. What followed was not a triumph of arms, but a descent into ruin. It became a story of hubris, endurance, and catastrophe, the march that devoured an empire, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Napoleon later said, is but a step. And in Russia, he would make that step. The background to this invasion was rooted in the uneasy alliance between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. The two emperors had posed together on a raft in the Niemen River, smiling for the world. France and Russia were to be partners, bound by marriage diplomacy, mutual respect, and Napoleon's continental system of blockade meant to strangle British commerce. But in practice, the blockade was disastrous for Russia. Its ports, closed to British goods, crippled the economy. Russian nobles and merchants fumed. The Tsar himself grew weary of French demands and Napoleon's arrogance. By 1810, Alexander had reopened trade with Britain, defying the French emperor outright. For Napoleon, this was more than betrayal, it was a threat to his vision of European order. He declared that Russia must be taught a lesson, and he began to assemble the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Historians call it the Grande Armée, led by 0 men drawn from France, Italy, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and even distant Spain. It was not merely an army. It was a moving city of soldiers, horses, artillery, wagons, and supply trains. From the west, they advanced to the Niemen River, where Napoleon, recalling Tilsit, declared, "Soldiers, the Second Polish War has begun. The first ended at Friedland and Tilsit. The second will end at Moscow." The build-up to the invasion was monumental. Napoleon believed in the speed of decision. He had crushed Austria, Prussia, and Russia before by swift marches and decisive battles. He expected the Tsar to fight at the frontier, to defend Lithuania and Poland, and to negotiate after the first defeat. But the Russians had learned from past disasters. Alexander and his generals, Barclay de Tolly and later Prince Kutuzov, pursued a different strategy. They refused to give battle. Instead, they withdrew deeper into the Russian heartland, burning crops and villages behind them. It was the scorched earth strategy, a policy of denial. Napoleon advanced, but his men found little to eat, little to seize, and little to sustain them. The further they marched, the longer their supply lines stretched, vulnerable to raids, disease, and hunger. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. In July, he entered Vilnius. In August, he reached Smolensk, where the Russians finally made a stand. The battle was fierce, with the city consumed in flames. French troops stormed through smoke and fire, but the Russians again withdrew, leaving only ashes behind. The cost was heavy. Disease had begun to eat through the army, and thousands had fallen by the roadside, abandoned to fate. In September came the climax of the campaign, Berezina. It was the largest and bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. The field stretched west of Moscow, where the Russians, under Kutuzov, dug in with redoubts, earthworks, and batteries of cannon. Napoleon's men, around 130,000, met Kutuzov's 120,000 in a storm of fire and steel. The fighting raged for 12 hours. French columns attacked again and again, capturing the Great Ravsky Redoubt at horrendous cost. The Russian lines bent but did not break. At day's end, some 70,000 men lay dead or wounded on the field. Napoleon had won the ground, but not the war. Famously, he refused to commit his elite imperial guard, fearing he would need them later. "The guard will be kept for tomorrow," he said. But tomorrow never came. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow. The city lay eerily silent. Its people had fled, and soon its wooden houses erupted in flames. Whether by accident or deliberate Russian sabotage, much of Moscow burned, denying the French shelter and supplies. Napoleon waited, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. But no envoy came. In St. Petersburg, Alexander resolved that Russia would never surrender its holy city or its independence. "We will not make peace while a single enemy remains on Russian soil," the Tsar declared. For 5 weeks, Napoleon lingered in the charred ruins, hoping for a miracle. Instead, the Russian winter crept closer. By mid-October, he had no choice but to retreat. What followed was a nightmare march through snow, ice, and starvation. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest host in Europe, disintegrated. Soldiers marched barefoot, wrapped in rags, gnawing on horseflesh. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed thousands each day. Cossack cavalry harassed the columns, striking like wolves at the stragglers. Rivers froze, then thawed, swallowing men and wagons. At the Berezina River in November, the French struggled to build bridges under fire. They succeeded, but at terrible cost, leaving tens of thousands dead or captured by December. Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris in a sleigh, fearing for his throne. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen, perhaps 100,000 returned. Some estimates place the survivors even lower. The invasion was not merely a defeat. It was annihilation. The immediate aftermath shocked Europe. Napoleon, once thought invincible, had been humbled. Prussia and Austria, still bound as allies, began to waver. In 1813, they would join the Sixth Coalition against him. Within 2 years, Napoleon would be driven into exile. For Russia, the victory was costly but glorious. The suffering of the campaign burned itself into the nation's memory, celebrated in church bells and folk songs as a triumph of endurance over tyranny. The legacy of 1812 reaches far beyond the battlefields. It marked the turning point of Napoleon's empire, the moment when conquest gave way to collapse. It demonstrated the power of space, climate, and national will over even the greatest military genius. Leo Tolstoy would later immortalize it in War and Peace, depicting not only the battles but the spirit of the Russian people. Historians continue to debate Napoleon's decisions. Why did he advance so far? Why did he not stop at Smolensk? Why did he delay in Moscow? Yet all agree that 1812 revealed the limits of empire and the peril of ambition without measure. Even today, the march on Moscow haunts the imagination. It stands beside other doomed invasions of Russia. Charles XII of Sweden in 1709, Hitler's Wehrmacht in 1941 as a warning written in blood and snow. For France, it was the beginning of the end. For Russia, it was a crucible of resilience. And for the world, it remains one of history's most powerful tales of human endurance against the tide of war. This documentary was created with painstaking research, weaving together eyewitness accounts, military records, and the scholarship of centuries. If you value high-quality, historical storytelling, Consider supporting the effort to bring these voices from the past alive again. History is not just memory, is the mirror of human ambition, triumph, and tragedy.